This episode is going to feel like the good old days because we've got some brand new H&R coilovers to put on Jeremy's E28 that he just brought down from LA. And if you haven't seen the episode about him and his car, you have to do that first. But now we're going to make this arguably perfect car even better. Let's get to it. If there are two things that go hand in hand under the StanceWorks brand name, it's vintage BMWs and modifying their suspension. This is what we've been doing as friends for more than a decade, so this is our home turf. And today, we've got Jeremy's E28 535 going under the knife for some suspension revisions. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with what's on there, but when presented with the opportunity to make things better, you know that we're going to take it. But if you've ever messed with the suspension on a vintage BMW, you know it's hardly ever a bolt-on affair. Typically, one must weld coilovers onto their factory spindles, and we get to avoid that this time around, but we do have to make parts from Jeremy's old suspension work with the new. So one of the first things that we're going to have to figure out in swapping these coilovers over is that right now, Jeremy has ground control camber plates, which are, for the most part, universal. You can use them on any type of shock that you want. However, shocks have different diameters, and we don't know what diameter the shocks that are in here are, so we might have to custom machine some sleeves to adapt them to work with the H&Rs. We don't know yet. So first, we're gonna get the fronts pulled, pretty obvious first step. We gotta do some measuring and figure out if we gotta machine anything to make this whole thing work. But first, let's talk about the parts that we're going to be installing on the car. This is a complete coilover conversion from our friends at H&R. With it, we're going to convert a show car to a usable street car. Stoked to see more E28 content from our boys at H&R. They've got good taste too. Now, given that we put this exact same suspension on my white E28, you guys have seen these parts before, but there's a reason we're going to them again. This is the single best coilover system you can put on an E28 as far as I'm concerned. This system was dialed in perfectly, and I know Jeremy's going to love it. I am inconsolably hungry right now. That's the new level that we're taking the StanceWorks vlog episodes to, is you get to see the real me and hear about how hungry I am all the time. That's all I talk about. So hungry, so hungry. Now, part of what makes this coilover system so special is that there's no welding involved. This is a bolt-on system that is made to order in Germany. The spindle is integrated into the coilover, which means we've got to install some fresh parts like hubs, but otherwise it's ready to go. Yeah, you got to admit, these things do look pretty good. It's a bummer that they're hidden underneath the car because they're beautiful. You know, the way these coilovers look is really the justification that Jeremy used to buy this very expensive 2-car 4-post lift that's in his garage, video here. It's so that you can see the coilovers while the cars are parked inside, right?
Yeah, it's just a little too pretty to hide.
Too pretty to hide. Now, on top of having an integrated spindle that doesn't require welding, this system is also sprung and valved specifically for the E28 chassis. This isn't a universal solution, but instead one that is engineered specifically for it. And that's why we're swapping these coilovers out. Jeremy's going to explain that better later on in the episode, but for now, let's talk about snags, because we're about to hit a few of them. None of them are detrimental, but for anybody that considers themselves a weekend warrior, it's no different here in this shop either. Small stuff trips us up, catches us off guard, or even sets us back every single time. In fact, we had barely even gotten started removing the old suspension from the E28 before we had to get out the tools and start fixing a problem. Our first snag is that the brake retaining screw is stripped. And it's an Allen head, which makes it very annoying. How it got stripped, I don't know. You just go the wrong way on it. But it's stripped. We gotta figure out how to get it out. Jeremy, you gonna try drilling it out?
Probably, yeah.
All right, we're getting out the drill. And I know you guys love to imagine that I have every tool under the sun, but what I do not have is a truly good set of drill bits, which makes this particular job a real pain. Some of you will surely know that shuffle to and from the toolbox with every drill bit you've got, trying to find one sharp enough to get the job done. Yeah, that was us trying to get this dang brake rotor off, but eventually it did come off and we were able to move forward with getting everything disassembled.
All right, so some of you are probably wondering, why are we taking off perfectly good coilovers to put on another set? These were put on the car about a decade ago, and they were designed with one thing in mind, which was going as low as possible. So the height you've seen this car at previously and the video that we did was all the way up on these, and I actually wanted a touch higher, both for performance reasons, and it's actually scraping going onto the lift in my garage right now. So we looked to H&R, who have been my friends for quite a while, for what is, in my opinion, the best coilover solution for the E28. That's gonna get us that additional height we need. The damping is set up a bit better for how I drive the car these days, and I really think it's gonna transform how this drives.
And on top of getting that ground clearance he's looking for, the ride quality is going to improve immensely thanks to the spring rate and the dampers.
All right, so now we are doing something that is a little non-conventional, or depending on what part of the car scene you've been in, very conventional, which is taking the helper springs off. What these do is at full droop, they'll keep a little tension on the spring so you don't have any sort of knocking around with that. With this diameter, it's not gonna go anywhere, but it can make some noise. What I've done is put a 10-inch wide wheel on the front, and if we have the bottom spanners, it's not spanners, perch here, it's gonna interfere with my wheel. So with taking that helper spring off, we'll get to spin these up higher, which I'm not gonna be able to do by hand.
In short, we've got to move these perches upwards because Jeremy wants to put the widest wheels possible on this car, and if they're here where the spring would have them sit, they'll hit the wheel. This fully compressed, which it would be at any point the car is driving, has a stack height of about 1 inch. So if we take it out, we can move these collars up 1 inch or maybe a little bit more, giving us the clearance we need for that wheel to sit right up against the shock body, and everything clears. The only downside is, technically speaking, it could make some noise at full droop, but it's not really an issue. Sorry in advance, H&R, we're modifying things a little bit here. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that there is a critical difference between helper springs and tender springs. The springs you see here are helpers. They only keep tension on the spring during suspension travel. A tender spring is for a dual rate system, and that is not what we have here, so there's really no harm in removing these helper springs other than the risk of a little bit of sound depending on how Jeremy's driving in and out of aggressive parking lots. But with the helper springs removed and the primary springs reinstalled, we need to install our camber plates, and that brings us back to the issue that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. We've got to solve some shock shaft diameter questions in order to mount these effectively to the H&R shocks. Now we also have our answer regarding these camber plates and whether or not we're gonna have to make anything custom in order for them to work with our new coilovers, and we've gotten pretty lucky. The most important piece of the puzzle is this lower mount for the camber plate. It has two dimensions that matter most, the inside diameter and the outside diameter. The inside has to play well with the shock, and the outside we already know works with the part it came off of, and that's where we got lucky. This is the correct ID for our new shocks. It's gonna work great. The only problem is there's kind of an opposite one of these that should go on top that holds the whole shock body centered within the bearing here, and it's just missing. It hasn't been on here in a long time. Who knows where it is? So we're gonna have to make a solution. Now I have these parts sitting around, and thankfully it's correct in every regard. All we have to do is turn down the OD, the outside diameter, to fit inside of the bearing. And once we do that, this whole thing will fit together. It won't make any noise. It'll be the correct solution. It'll be better than it ever was before. Downside is my lathe does not like cutting steel, so we're gonna take this over to Brett's and have him turn it down for us so it turns out nicely. Which means a trip over to Nimmo Machine. And I'm hopeful at this point you all know who Brett Walker is, but for those that are new to the channel, Brett is a, well, let's just put it this way, a master of all trades as far as I'm concerned. There's no job too big, or in this case, too small, just a simple turn-down operation on some stubborn steel. It didn't take long for Brett to finish the machining job that we brought to him, given that this is truly basic stuff, and to be honest, I should probably get a little bit of flack for not doing it ourselves. But, as always, Brett did a perfect job, and these pieces are done. And while we were at Nimmo Machine, Jeremy got busy installing some of the other pieces onto his coilovers, such as new wheel hubs and dust shields. We did recover the brake shields from the old coilovers so that we can move them over to the new setup. With everything installed, it's time for final assembly of the coilovers, including the camber plates up top. The nuts that Brett machined will cap the entire thing and hold it all together, meaning at this point we are finally ready to install these on Jeremy's car. But that does bring us to another minor snag. You'll notice that Jeremy's old coilovers have wheel studs installed, while these do not. Jeremy needs those extended studs in order to run his spacers, because without the spacers, his custom BBS wheels won't clear the strut housing, and from there, none of this will work. In an ideal world, we'd simply move the studs from the old hubs to the new ones. But one got stuck in place, and we damaged the threads during the removal process, meaning we had to find a set of new studs in town in order to get this project done. It wasn't the end of the world, but it's another one of those hang-ups that costs an hour of time in order to fix a problem that we shouldn't have encountered. But with that stud issue figured out, it was time to move on to the back of the car and install the coilovers at the tail end. Thankfully, this process is as straightforward as it gets. 3 bolts up top and 1 on the bottom. It helps to have a second set of hands to hold the coilover in place while you try to reach around and put the nuts onto the top of it, but otherwise, it doesn't get any easier. We knocked the tail end of the car out in roughly half an hour, and can cross the coilover install itself off the list. It's officially done. But if there's one thing I know about Jeremy, it's that he's even more of a perfectionist than I am, so he's not quite done yet. Now, if you're wondering why it's now day 2 of what should have been probably like a 4 or 5 hour job, that's a fair question. But as you guys can see, we've hit so many just tiny little annoying snags that have set us back 30 minutes at a time, each one inconsequential, but each one pushing us further and further into today. Now, thankfully, we finished everything up last night. All Jeremy's doing now is dialing in his ride height, getting it perfect so the car sits exactly the way that he wants. And my job today is to modify his center caps. He got these from Closed Course Motorsports, and they're held in by O-rings, but we got to talk about wheels for these to make total sense before you understand why I'm going to modify them. These are Jeremy's BBS E50s, and they are a BBS motorsport wheel. By the name, you can probably imagine they are built with motorsports in mind, and as a result, they have no real meaningful provision for a wheel center cap. After all, race cars don't have center caps, and most series won't allow you to run them because they're not going to stick around long enough for anybody to see them. But given that this is a street car, Jeremy wanted to buy a set of center caps to run on these magnesium-centered wheels. And so this was the result. A custom aluminum machine setup that uses O-rings to hold it into place. It's a creative idea, but in reality, it doesn't work all that well. Jeremy asked if I had any ideas on how to better secure these center caps, and I said, I think I can figure this out. After a little bit of brainstorming and a little bit less planning, I got the tools out and got to work. The first course of action was to drill 3 equally spaced holes on the back side of each of these center cap retaining rings. I realized that the jaws on the chuck of the lathe would actually give me 3 equally spaced markers, so I clamped the parts and got to drilling. My thought process was that with 3 equally spaced holes, we could put set screws into place and lock this to the wheel. So now we need to thread these holes for some very tiny set screws. When I say small, I mean very small. We're talking M4 threads in order to fit this part. And this, of course, is the perk of having a McMaster car relatively close by. We could get tiny set screws and the associated tap in order to do this job locally. The finished product looks pretty good, and I decided I'd also go on and put one of the O-rings back into place just for a bit of safekeeping. I couldn't come up with a good reason not to install it, and I realized it does help center the center cap into its opening. Last but not least, of course, we've got to reinstall the caps themselves, which is a simple snap fit with a retaining ring. With all 3 set screws locked into place, I think it's safe to say these aren't going anywhere, and if you ask me, these are a major improvement in the way the wheels look. I think this is a great outcome, and Jeremy should be very happy with the result. He got the ride height dialed in, and now the wheels can go back on for the final time. We're rounding the final corner, and it's just about time to test drive this thing and see how we did. Like pretty close to where it was before, but
we're just a touch higher. The big thing for me, I do drive this pretty hard in the canyon, so that little bit of extra breathing room, maybe can take some rear passengers now, will be nice, and I'm mostly excited to go see how it drives at this point.
Well, it's gonna ride good, I can tell you that much. If only I hadn't sold that one so we could drive them side by side. That'd be great.
Yeah, it's the forbidden fruit sitting over there.
I suppose it's no surprise, but Jeremy's car looks as good, if not better, than ever. He did an amazing job dialing in the ride height, and believe it or not, despite the low height and aggressive wheel and tire fitment, this thing rides like a dream and is ready to carve the canyons. The harsh, jarring ride quality from before has been completely rectified. This thing is so much more comfortable on the roads, and is finally better suited to carrying passengers in the back seat as well. The subtle change in ride height is wonderfully executed and makes this one of the best looking E28s both inside and out. For those that haven't seen, the inside of Jeremy's E28 has been completely redone as well, with distressed peanut butter leather interior for the front seats, rear seats, and door panels, along with a black M5 headliner and lots of accents scattered about. The motorsport gold centers on the BBSs are the perfect color accent for an otherwise monochromatic project, and it's with good reason that myself and plenty of others would consider this to be one of the best looking E28s, period. Wrenching on this car over the weekend was a ton of fun and reminded me exactly why Jeremy and I became friends to begin with. We've bonded over these cars for more than a decade, and this was like revisiting the good old days.